It's a simple answer to a complex question. Austerity changed the social contract in this country. It gutted, the social fabric. Why don't I get a bailout? Why do the bankers get a bailout? Campaigners like Nigel Farage and so on, very cheap and very attractive for companies to just import some skilled workers. London's economy is very vulnerable. Social norms are very different. Should never interpret austerity in isolation. We tend to have very strong regional identities. There should be a mindset of trying to work on problems and resolving them together.
Did austerity cause Brexit?
Really, this is the problem, because I really hate when people ask me this question. Of course, it's a very provocative statement. Did austerity cause Brexit? But if we look at the joint evidence of all the data that has come out since then, since I wrote that paper, I think the answer has to be unanimously yes. Austerity changed the social contract in this country in a way that people did not recognize it for what it was. It gutted public services. It gutted, the social fabric of communities in many, many ways. And it redefined the relationship between citizens and the state in a way that, of course, we're still reeling from that in terms of its consequences. Attitudes towards paying tax, to contributing to the commons, all of these have been eroded because, it is a policy mix that has put people squarely into a mindset of, not wanting to share and not seeing the benefit and purpose of public spending. And of course, that is now put in very sharp contrast with the anti-austerity that we might see in the context of rearmament when the state becomes very visibly and tangible as a provider of security, as a public good that is sort of in some conceptions of what nation states are and why nations exist. That's the founding principle of a state, that it provides external security, security against external threats. And so from that perspective, yes, austerity very much caused Brexit. The narratives around Brexit are, however, incredibly confusing and obviously shaped by political engineering and, opportunistic messaging in a way that, of course, diffuses blame and accountability for a policy mix that at the time was, again, you can rationalize why the policy mix was done, but it's very hard to justify, the incidents as to who and what communities and how the burden was felt. We should never interpret austerity in isolation. It happened in the context of, structural transformation. Our economies were rapidly and very visibly changing, with online commerce gutting the fabric of many communities, which would be attached to retail and hospitality and services, broadly speaking. That was changing the communities across this country in many ways that people would perceive to be objectively worse. At the same time, we had growing structural challenges about how this society, and many actually Western societies, maintain sort of a layer of basic skills, with occupations like that traditionally would be associated with good jobs, like skilled tradespeople and so on and so forth, not wanting or not seeing the purpose of investing in upskilling people, because ultimately, again, the proliferation of the platform-based economies made it very easy it made it very cheap and very attractive for companies to just import some skilled workers and not invest in the skill base in this country. And of course, that implies that there's a gutting out of jobs that we typically would associate with being decent or good jobs for people, let's say, that might have, well, it sounds a bit blunt, but, that might not come to be, become, academics or working in research, right? So people with less cognitive, skills, this was a great absorber where, retail, hospitality, and some of the skilled trades, when people are really good with their hands, that is what the economy provided, and that is what sort of was under onslaught by, decades of, offshoring, internationalization, and changing in the way that our economy works, in particular around intermediation services that left their mark on communities and also on underlying tax bases. And so, we have to interpret the context of austerity within that structural transformation. And that actually was, I think, one of the most important plots in that paper, on austerity, did austerity cause Brexit? Which came at the end that sort of highlighted how, we had been having this growing skill divide, whereby essentially people on high skills or, with high educational attainment saw a continuous relative incline or increase over decades in their earnings. And we had, in relative terms, a decline of people with low skills or low levels of educational attainment. And there was this brief period where essentially the welfare state and, which obviously was tackled with austerity, was helping cushion these growing divides in a way that, could be interpreted as social contract. I always refer to it as the Band-Aid. And that Band-Aid got removed with the welfare cuts and, the cuts in particular to public spending. And the country and most Western European countries are reeling from the consequences of that austerity through basically having a dysfunctional, or what many perceive to be a dysfunctional state now, that is not able to cope with the many challenges that it's being confronted with. And that was obviously most obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic, and is now again very obvious in the context of the the ongoing worsening of the security situation in Europe and other parts of the world, which very much raised the scepter of is the state able to do what might be the foundational contract that it's supposed to do, which is protect and provide the security. And through that, we give the state the monopoly of force and coercion and violence. I mean, that's the contract. And so, yes, without sort of, again, it's a simple answer to a complex question. But I resoundingly say, yes, it has. It has not been, it has been the sort of the tip on the iceberg that sort of, that led things to flip over. It got enough people to be sufficiently upset about the status quo that they voted for something that was promising a pie in the sky, that was a different political product to different audiences. So perfect marketing, so to say. It was selling, the same label as being a different product for different audiences, but obviously very dishonest. But it was enough to create sort of that latent anger that politicians then attributed, towards certain groups. There's one paper I think is very important where we see this quite nicely. And it also is in my view, it's a good articulation of the state of affairs with journalism, because actually journalism is not as digitally literate or as statistically literate sometimes as I would wish it to be. In and around the run-up to Brexit, places like Boston in the north, in the northeast, heavily featured in a lot of the public media coverage around it. If we look at the data around, and of course, campaigners like Nigel Farage and so on, they very much heavily drew on the image of, the immigration, the sort of the threat of the others, the foreigners, those who don't belong here, right? The othering, so to say. And on that one, they always drew the example of Boston. Boston was in that case a good outlier, because it was both incredibly sharply affected by austerity in many, many ways. The economy had been sort of cobbled by cuts to public spending, and there's a lot of people who were on benefits, so they were very much affected by sort of the changes in the benefit system. And at the same time, it was also one of the few locations that had a lot of immigration, and the immigration wave that mattered for that matter at that time was the immigration wave from Eastern Europe following the European Union accession. And so that was a place where the two coincides, where they had strong austerity push and strong influx to immigration. And that was used to channel that anger and the narrative, of course, in the context of the visual images of, the geopolitical weaponization of migration flows by, in this case, actually, it was Turkey that sort of enabled mass movement of people, of Syrians to Europe, which of course, it was that combination, the label immigration, the fact that in Boston, immigration austerity coincided, that made it very possible to create a narrative link. When in fact, statistically speaking, immigrants did not go to the places where there was significant, immigration, and so the growth of populism is very, very weakly associated. And so it was basically a very good example of narrative engineering, in a way that was made possible by a relatively statistically illiterate media environment, and where the external context provided a lot of strong, charged visual cues that made it salient. All the while, when we look at the context of when we look at what people were reporting on when they said, why are you unhappy with the status quo, so to say? Well, it was funding for the NHS. It was things about potholes. It was about the public infrastructure fraying. It was about waiting lists for this and that and housing and all of this, which are all entirely domestic problems. These are all entirely possible to be adjusted through improving the state's function, and not necessarily by attributing blame to the typically young immigrants who come to the UK to work here, and typically, you know, you know, they come here for education. They might be educated. They pay into the education system. They pay the tuition fees and whatnot, and then end up working, paying social security tax, rather than being portrayed as these benefit scroungers as they're typically being portrayed. Of course, there's some immigrant groups where social norms are very different, such as, for example, from Southeast Asia, where it's much more common for women to stay at home, if they're married couples or dependents. So they're more traditional in that respect. And whereas the UK society and economy is all geared about having two incomes, having two people in work. And of course, that creates an asymmetry, but that's down to the fact that you're importing effectively conservatives. You're importing people into society that are living with sort of norms that are quite back. Whereas the European immigrants, who were the relevant migrant target group at the time, they're very much more likely to be socialized very similar to the British, meaning, much more egalitarian, both, partners, would work. There's a lot of cross marriages that arose from that immigration wave between British and, Polish or, other Western Europeans. It's just been a very disconnected portrayal of a group of individuals in the context of where there was a lot of pent up anger, but that pent up anger had nothing to do with immigration. It had a lot to do with the inability of the state to function well. And of course, we could interpret this as that structural, the structural, unevenness, because public sector work is on average much less attractive than private sector work for the people that traditionally you would actually want to be in the public sector. And that, I think, is sort of, a very important dimension here, because of course this way you deprive the public sector of the talent that it might need. Whereas traditionally speaking, a lot of the public sector would have been the best employer to have. It would be high status, secure jobs. It would attract the best and the brightest. That was traditionally what people associate with the public sector. But that has been sort of gradually eroded. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised that this comes with an erosion of public sector capabilities. Throw in some rapid technological progress and aging at the top, you end up in a dysfunctional state. I mean, for me, the story of austerity, again, the problem with, sorry, I'm rambling a lot, but you're probably going to cut stuff together. Anyways, but to me, the problem of austerity is that it just came in a very toxic mix, with aging societies, rapid technological progress. Oftentimes, there's a lot of technological optimism in the public sector. It's a very common thing, saying, "Oh, we can do things now much more efficient, much more quick." But you still need the people who do the doing, so to say, and not just have sort of the grand ideas. And that is where the disconnect comes in. And the consequence, in my understanding of what happened with austerity, both actually in Germany as well as in the UK, is very similar story, except the Germans' public finances, on average, we saved even more on our public infrastructure, so to say. And I think there's slightly less profiteering, racketeering, as you have it in the institutional culture in the UK. But basically, what happened is that, as one of the prime targets of austerity was to reduce the state. To reduce the state's attractiveness, you basically reduce public payrolls. You make the public sector financially less attractive. Now, if you think about the logic of a human organization, if the only way you can have pay progression then in the public sector is not through upgrading of your salary, you would have pay progression through promotion. And so basically what this might have enabled, and that's a hypothesis, is very important to test. But unfortunately, that type of data, I still have not come around to getting access to it. It might create a conveyor belt of talent that might not be, let's say, counterfactually the best talent that you would want to be promoted. Because that's, again, it's human organizations. People look out for each other. It's a natural thing, right? And you see, oh, they've just had a kid. How can they afford, So let's just give them a grander job title and maybe put them in a role of responsibility where they might or might not be a good fit. And I think that is also part of the corrosive effect of austerity, because that way you ended up building and graduating an incompetent public sector. By essentially promoting people potentially beyond where they are. And again, this is a very sensitive, people might respond to this very aggressively or very adversely. I don't want to cause any offense, but if you think about a meta picture, and just think about the economics of the incentives around it, and if promotion is your pathway to a raise and your payroll is being gutted, so to say, your wage progression is being gutted, that's a logical institutional reaction to it in an environment where people look out and care for one another, which again is something that I think on average is a desirable feature in organizations, because again, life is weird. And, in the end of the day, care and compassion is something that we would want to be exercised and lived through, not just on an interpersonal day-to-day basis, but also through and from our organization. But in that process, the whole reason why we have such organizations is that they can behave in a way that we as humans might not be able to behave, and basically being a bit more like assholes, being a bit less, less relatable, being a bit more cold-shouldered. That's why we bundle ourselves into institutions. And that's all founded by economic theory. An organization can be risk-taking in ways that a private individual might not come around to themselves being risk-taking. And so, again, it's a long legacy. Yeah, it's a long story.
To be honest, there's a lot of points there that I think I'd love to sort of dive off of, sort of address. Almost like don't know where to which one to pick. I think to start off with, though, I think we need to paint the background a little bit more on the austerity environment. So I think it's almost impossible to talk about the austerity period without first talking about the 2008 financial crisis and basically the implications that came with that. Could you just give me a bit of background on not necessarily the details of the financial crisis, but what the effects of that event were and how it led into a policy of austerity by the UK government?
Yeah, again, everybody has their own reading of what happened in and around the financial crisis, but my understanding is that it's basically been, when you're in the financial service industry, there is ways of making money that would seem just very weird, right? So if you have, for example, an individual loan agreement between an individual, that loan agreement pays an interest. And of course, that is risky if, one individual can't pay their loan, right? Now, imagine you have thousands of loan agreements with thousands of idiosyncratic individuals. What will happen just from the mere statistics of it, as long as the underlying correlation structures stay the same, that bundle of 1,000 loan agreements will give you what looks like a very safe return.
It's much more diversified, so it mitigates a lot of the risk
Because you're
elements.
diversified, exactly. You're diversified. Now, what happened in and around the global financial crisis was that the correlation structure and some beliefs around the correlatedness of my risk and your risk changed. And that is what led to an unraveling of these financial products, where then all of the sudden the risks became correlated, the beliefs in the ever booming property markets declined, which was, it's a very stupid way, I think, of organizing societies and very vulnerable. But that is what then triggered a collapse in the, or sort of a freeze of the property markets, a calling in of securities that led to foreclosures, that itself then led to more properties being put on the market. Then the asking prices were going down, the valuations were down adjusted, and then sort of you had to raise the securitization. The correlation structure changed and broke down. Actually, we see something very similar going on right now, which is very concerning. With and in and around, obviously, the external and the geopolitics, but it's a different part. And so that led to that collapse. And you had to essentially recapitalize the financial institutions that were sort of exposed to that, fallout risk. And that drew in a lot of public resources. Had to a lot of debt had to be issued to essentially recapitalize and risk and save the banks that became systemically risky and too big to fail. It also, I think, by the UK government, again, other governments, and of course, central banks came, there was debt monetization, went into the process of stabilizing the system. There was basically no other choice, so to say, that they had at the time. They were very, very much on the hook. And they also had to bring in cash from abroad, which I think that is also part of the legacy of that global financial crisis, because it increased the vulnerability of the British society from malign interference, or let's call it any form of interference in society, from abroad, creating these vulnerabilities. And so that is sort of the story, right? And of course, it created these very powerful narratives of saying, well, why don't I get a bailout? Why do the bankers get a bailout? What is it that they're doing? They're literally, that's technically what you do. You're solving a mathematical problem of working out what the correlation structure is, and then you're bundling something that looks like, a structured financial product that hinges on the stability of these correlation structures, which of course means that the financial system through that is very averse to any type of change, because it is, that's a side effect from that, because you don't want the correlation structures, you're banking in the stability of these correlation structures around these financial products. But in the end of the day, it's a way of smart people with access to data being able to make money off the backs of your monthly mortgage payments or your monthly loan repayments or whatnot. And so that is obviously so why people, and of course people might perceive, again, if you're German, your relationship with debt is a different one because the word has a moral connotation. Maybe in the UK, everybody is like super indebted and people are totally fine. But I do think it adds to stress and anxiety in people's lives. And so it's naturally that when that happens, when they have the stress and anxiety from the debt because they just want to make ends meet or potentially meet, other, costs that just came up, to pay for some medical treatment or whatnot. There's many reasons why people seek out debt, right? they, when they then see how those who created that instability vectors, the structured financial product, effectively get a bailout from the state, many people say, well, the system is crooked. Something's not quite right. And then when, as a consequence of that, the state then says, oh, now we've got to cut spending. We've got to cut your access to your public libraries. We've got to cut access to your into youth clubs. We can't afford to have the police on the street as much. We're going to cut police force numbers. We're going to cut defense, which is also something that, had some links. While at the same time, again, and I'm a very much proponent of foreign aid, there was, of course, an expansion of foreign aid. And that's a very important thing. It's an investment in the ability of the UK to have good relationships with other countries going forward and build trade relationships. But that being aside, if you have that, it's invariably that then people say, well, who's gonna be exposed to these cuts? Is it the people who are reading, the leaflet in the FT saying how to spend it, or is it the people who can't make ends meet, and have their benefits cut, or is it the people who are getting upset about the fact that they see more people rough sleeping because vulnerable people were limited in terms of their access to social and assisted housing, and thereby becoming angry about that. And again, I've did some work on housing insecurity and visible on-street homelessness, right? Which again is, in my understanding and my study of the data, a direct consequence of the changes in the in and around the world. So from that perspective, it's very easy how you can spin a narrative from, the bankers that get the bailouts, that sold us a financial product, over, frankly, possibly quite inflated real estate prices, because the society by Margaret Thatcher has been put into an equilibrium of not building any houses anymore, where everybody's just banking on property price inflation, depriving the next generation of. You can totally see how you can spin a narrative and tap into that latent anger that's in there. And of course, the incidence and the burden of austerity very much became felt, because the state is about 1/3 easily of the economy, and it's very visible through, and people associate the state with fixing the potholes. They associate the states with providing basic education, and that's where they are programmed to attribute this. And the British are, in that sense, very European. They don't want all the schools to be privately run and all the healthcare centers, everything to be privately run, because if anything is obvious, it's that the US is not a healthy society. In a way that, it's not like a role model that I think the UK should aspire to in terms of emulating. But yeah, so it's very easy to see how, those who felt both directly and indirectly the consequences of austerity within their communities had a lot of anger.
Yep.
And it is the role of the populists, or it's what they do, is to channel these emotions in certain opportunistic directions. And that is what the Leave campaign did quite expertly. We had one representation of the change and one representation of the status quo, where many people felt the status quo is not working, and people were like, yeah, to heck with it. Of course, not being aware of the consequences that this would have down the line.
Gotcha. And just briefly, what kind of them were the mechanisms? We talked a little bit about it there, but what were the mechanisms by which Britain was initiating austerity? Is it specifically just through spending cuts on things like the police, welfare bills, and all this kind of stuff? Was it tax increases? Was it bailouts in obviously certain instances? And was it also, if it cutting, is it cutting in certain areas and not others?
So this was the funny thing with austerity, because it was a reflection of who shows up to vote, who can afford to be engaged in politics and invest time and knowing about politics. So in and around that time, we had the introduction of the triple lock, which basically decouples pension growth, state pension growth, from productivity and wage increases, which means the benefactors from that will be pensioners who in real terms become better off relative to the working class, or the working age demographic. So that was an element of the state re-architecture, which is very problematic. I can see that why there's a reasoning why you might want to do that, because the UK has a very big problem in terms of people don't save for old age, right? Or they save only through their accumulating wealth and housing. So that was one thing. So we actually had some expansive forms of public spending, and it's older people who also spend their money and stuff like that. So there's different things than younger people. So there's a life cycle dimension to it. But then in terms of the incidence of austerity, we had huge cuts to local authority budgets, across the board, easily, 30, 40% in nominal terms. So in real terms, I mean, that's accumulated over many years, even worse. So there was a gutting of the delivery layer, where again, people did not account for what it does to communities, right? I can elaborate on this. So we had local governments cuts. We had then cuts to de facto tax increases by stealth, which was through essentially a limiting of tax credits to families, so phasing out some tax credits earlier. So that's kind of hidden the type of tax increase on working age adults. And we had, of course, a vast menu of welfare cuts that took the form of one form, again, which I can rationalize, for example, from a climate perspective, is the bedroom tax. We had a decoupling of the local housing assistance for people on housing benefits from local rents, make them less generous. So basically, places became less affordable, which again was a zero sum, had another sort of consequence to it. And we had basically a gradual erosion of the attractiveness of public sector work by essentially reducing public sector pay or not indexing it with inflation, but like de-indexing it, so to say. And that meant that basically public sector salaries were, eroded and so became kind of cheaper. And so we can now talk about the consequences of each. I think for me, the perspective of local cuts, I can see some elements of why it's important, because at the local level, there is a lot of spending that probably doesn't live up to the scrutiny and the accountability that we would wish it to be. Or it could happen. The risk is higher, right? If you have many more pots allocating money, right, the risk is much higher. But basically what local governments then did, again, it's the logic of a self-preserving organization. They cut what was not necessary, which is planning and development, CapEx, any type of investment in public infrastructure, because that's disposable and can easily go. And of course, that meant that the fiscal, stabilizing function that local government budgets through, for example, planning and development have, is gutted. And planning and development, frankly, is really important to get housing going, right? To build, to build local plans, to build, and design public infrastructure. All of that was gutted. And so it actually structurally made the housing shortage and the housing crisis even worse, because in the local authorities and in local governments, the planning and development functions that are supposed to be forward-looking, designing spatial plans, climate adaptation, all of these things were gutted. And so it's not surprising that people now live with the legacy of that consequence, which is a chronic housing shortage, that, is has all other forms of collateral damage, up to the level where basically a whole generation goes on demographic strike. why the fuck should I put a child into this world when, I can expect that child to potentially get a shit job, have to pay for education, to end up with a decent, to get a good job, right? Have to pay through the nose for the education, to then not be able to get on the property ladder to have a decent life, with some basic form of security. People are just not up for it. There's a young generation that just goes on a demographic strike. So that, to me, for the local cuts, was the most severe one.
Certainly. And I think this brings us right into your paper on this. So we've outlined there the implementations of austerity and the background for it. How does this transition into the eventual referendum vote and the sentiments surrounding the outcome? Perhaps you could elaborate more on what the objectives of your research were and what kind of methodologies you were using.
Yeah. I mean, so the paper is very elegant insofar that it's almost like, statistically speaking, what you would call a zero knowledge proof. Of course, did austerity cause Brexit? You could say, I don't know, but it constructs pieces of evidence that, in their bundled together, it becomes very difficult to deny that it had anything to do with it. And so it basically starts with looking at the, UKIP, which was the brand of populism under Nigel Farage at the time, has been around since the since the 80s, actually, running first on campaigns for, in European parliamentary elections, and then increasingly contesting local elections, and then also contesting Westminster seats. The paper essentially starts out by just looking at how the correlation structure of what kind of profiles, and we could think of it as demographic profiles here, are backing populism, how that has changed, and the UKIP variety of populism has changed over time. And so you see that basically the growth in UKIP across local elections, European parliamentary elections, Westminster elections, again, there's all sorts of measurement issues with each one in turn, but that has exhibited a structural change. So there was a growth in UKIP when before it was not associated with, people in routine occupations or in manufacturing or with low educational attainment. Like, these correlation structures became ever and ever stronger, and they became decidedly stronger post 2010. So that's kind of like the questions of, well, what happened since 2010? Like, that might explain. Of course, you could say maybe UKIP entirely changed its supply of populism, as in, like, they completely pivoted everywhere. But that's where some data allow us, because the good thing with European parliamentary elections is that they are running on something like proportional representation, which means it's not an issue of only observing data because there's a candidate who runs, because in the European parliamentary election, there's candidates basically everywhere because you vote for a party, not for a candidate, or basically. So it's PR. And so we see that in all these pieces of data that suggest, yes, the target group or the individuals who became susceptible or warming up to populist ideas and populist campaigning and messaging, and became ever more, there was a structural change, and that structural change seemed to have onset since 2010. So it naturally begets the question, what happened since 2010, right? And then the next piece of evidence that I then offer is to look at, to offer a potential explanation of what happened since 2010. And that is, of course, the redefinition of the relationship with the state and its citizen. And one window through which I can make that much more easily measurable and, linkable is through the exposure to various forms of welfare cuts, or cuts to transfer payments, bedroom tax exposure. because the UK government actually in 2010 did run an ex-ante impact assessment, meaning they tried to model how many individuals would be affected by that. And when I then use these measures of exposure, and they're not at the individual level, they are at sort of, an area level. So in this area, there's this many people who will see a cut of their monthly transfer payments or benefit payments or that will be exposed to the bedroom tax. I have a signature that is very different in different areas. I can just do the same exercise. These people had existed most likely in these communities before 2010, but is having areas with more individuals exposed to, let's say, the bedroom tax, does that explain or is that correlated with, does it capture a change in the correlatedness with the UKIP support? Because we've seen UKIP support before 2010, UKIP support after 2010. The question is, places that would have had a lot of exposure to benefit cuts, to bedroom tax, they would have had that exposure most likely also already before 2010. But I see that before 2010, that vulnerability to it, the exposure of the bedroom tax cuts, was not correlated with UKIP voting, and it became correlated with UKIP support after 2010 in a way that also in many instances, very sharply tackles the sharp timing of these reforms. Such as, one thing came in 2013, I see that it starts picking up UKIP support in 2013, not in 2011, not in 2010, not in 2009, when it wasn't, a policy yet, right? And so that, again, is suggestive evidence that this matters and might have mattered. And so, of course, then you could still say, well, many things are going on and the places are different in many other ways. And, I'm measuring places, not people. So let's go to measure people. This is where I then look at UKIP support as expressed through individual level studies, so individual level panel data. So individuals keep on being interviewed for long-term panel studies like the Understanding Society panel study. And that means I observe the same individual over time. And in the case of the bedroom tax, I can even measure whether they would have been exposed to the bedroom tax by just looking at, okay, how many people are living in your household? Oh, it's this many people, this many people, this many dependents. So according to the function, the formula, you should have this many bedrooms. And I see you might have one too many. And that is a way of measuring the exposure of an individual to the bedroom tax. And again, within that small group of individuals, and I do that for a range of reforms, I see that the support for UKIP is increasing. I saw that the shock worked insofar that the people downsized. The bedroom tax sort of they over time reduced the number of bedrooms, which means they were forced to move. And in some other instances, I see that, for example, people fall behind their payments. They fall in arrears after there's been a cut to council tax benefit, for example, among the individuals that have been recipient of that type of benefit. And so, and of course, you can still say, okay, UKIP voting is not Leave voting. But then in the last exercise, I show that, of course, UKIP support and Leave voting are tightly correlated. And I can show that those individuals who switched to UKIP are also the ones that in the Understanding Society survey are more likely to have said that they supported Leave in the EU referendum vote, which also was elicited. Again, they might say, ex post, they might say they might not recall how they voted. Again, all of this just adds noise, but that's exactly why a small effect size, and the effects are not like ginormous and big, but because it's not super precisely measured everything, it's the conjoint evidence of it all coming together that is very, very powerful. And so, that's sort of why it's sort of a very compelling bit. Now, there's lots of things that didn't make it into the paper. There's subsequent papers but there's more things that one could have done on this. I mean, I think one thing that's really important, which is on the self-defeatingness of the austerity, is that benefit recipients, they spend all their income. they have a very high marginal propensity to consume.
Which makes sense, in
And that
fairness.
is,
Yeah.
which makes sense. Yeah. But that also meant that when you reduce private spending, transfer payments by whatever 10 billion, you will have a fiscal multiplier to that because these individuals will cease their spending.
Because
And
suddenly
so
that money's
part of
not being
the
spent in the
exercise,
local economy and on barbershops or wherever. And so, yeah,
local services. Exactly. And so I remember at some point I did the provocative calculation that the VAT receipts on the foregone economic activity alone basically neutralized the
really.
fiscal savings that that were made by these cuts in the first place. And so again, it actually had this double whammy where it was really doubling down on the economic shock to local economies. And we see the fallout from it today because that accelerated the decline of the high street because it's typically, again, people on benefits, so they're more likely to be active in their local economy. They're more likely to go to corner shops and, they're more likely to be part of the real tangible economy, not order something online. And so it actually doubled down on that shock that the UK is still reeling from, which is, I don't know, you might have seen this, but that's why I had this work on local decline, on, essentially what happens to the gutting of, communities and their high streets. And that's, of course, very difficult because we kind of feel like online shopping might be a good thing, right? It might make us better off in some form or the other.
And
But it
convenience,
has
access
these
to more
very tangible,
options. Yeah.
exactly, but it has these very tangible implications for the spatial economies where then our communities become ever less relatable because the only shops that and sort of outlets that survive are typically branded shops. And the branded shops are the ones, let's say, they might not have the relationship with their staff that, let's say, a mom and pop or a family shop might have.
Yeah.
Chains are more easily to just hire and fire, let go, rely on agency staff, to not have healthy long-term labor relations. And that again makes, of course, the high streets look the same everywhere. That was
Yeah.
one thing I noticed. I moved to the UK in 2008. I felt like, wow, it all looks the same. You go to high street here in this town, high street there in this town, it's all the same things. There's no
Yeah.
diversity here because it's the branded shops that could survive.
Yeah, that's actually such an interesting point that I hadn't necessarily considered. That, yeah, like obviously if you're receiving some kind of workplace or universal credit benefit, obviously your marginal propensity to consume is higher, which means you spend more of the money than you save. That's compared to, like, let's say, a wealthier person who, there's a limit to how much you can spend, even on luxury goods, right? A lot of it just gets saved or invested.
So yeah, wealthy people, again, it's a multiplier arbitrage in the grand scheme of things. The people with disposable and savings are the ones in between. But you could imagine that there's a philosophy of running an economy where you don't want savings sloshing about. You basically want the money to be committed because then it can also wreak
spent
no
or
havoc,
invested, yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it is interesting because, again, this whole period is certainly categorized, particularly in like the media, and you even see it now when Reform or the other parties, or even the mainstream parties, honestly, talk about the high streets looking very similar. The only shops you've got, to your point, are the big institutions, Tesco, Sainsbury's, and stuff, and then barber shops and chicken shops, essentially, because it's very hard to replace those things online, right? You can't get a haircut online. You can't get I mean, they're trying
Yeah.
to do food
And the
delivery
end
remotely and
result
stuff.
is a loss. Yeah, and the end result is a loss of identity.
Yeah.
Because when everything looks the same, then people feel like they don't, they lose their sense of community and their sense of belonging. Then you might move me here or there, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, a very kind of sad thing because in Europe, on average, we tend to have very strong regional identities and local identities. And it's a good thing because that creates community investment into community. And of course, when everything starts looking the same, if that diversity is lost, some people might perceive that as a loss of identity. And this is the funny thing, because the populists are bemoaning that loss of identity, when in fact, the economy is one big driver of that loss of identity. And as I said in this paper, there is sort of this legacy, that fallout from austerity. The unintended consequence was that it actually accelerated a structural transformation of the economy away from the spatial economy towards the online economy, in a way that the consequences were much more strongly felt the smaller the town is. Because the smaller the town is, well, you just can't have as high a diversity of, let's say, restaurants or shops, because the market size gets smaller and smaller. And so you're left with small. Like, I always use the example of London, because in London, you can have, the weirdest shops. I know that there's somewhere in Hackney, there's like a used amp shop.
Yeah.
There's a shop for amplifiers, used amplifiers. This could not survive somewhere in a small town.
No, and it's only allowed to because you have the sheer number of people, not just living in London, but also
exactly,
tourist activity.
That,
you're just not getting the foot traffic to have that level of specialization in a shop in, the rural Reading or something, or up in York,
exactly.
rural Yorkshire and stuff. And so, yeah, the internet's an important part of that as well, in terms of broadening your options for essentially sellers and commerce from a multitude of areas, even internationally. And so it's basically ended up in that because it's more efficient to do so, you basically get more urbanization. I imagine it's also led to I would imagine at least, led to sort of a perpetuation of urban versus more rural areas, or even like a north-south divide in many instances.
Exactly. And of course, austerity, in particular, the cuts to public spending, to local government spending, they were much more severely felt. In the small communities, if you're a small community council, you have a lot more sprawl to provide for. So there's a lot more road for the average citizen, so to say, that needs to be maintained, right? Because population is less dense. On average, I'm very deep into the geopolitics of it all as well. You could imagine that, as societies age, we want to pack the population more tightly. It's just more efficient to provide care and provide services, right? But of course, for rural communities, the same amount of cut was doing much more damage, because the responsibilities in upkeep were much higher, and the use of that infrastructure in terms of density was much lower. And so it's kind of an unfair, it's an unfair way of thinking about it. If there is a belief that, the countryside and the city are part of an integrated ecosystem, not in a sort of extracty, unhealthy relationship with one another. But that is, of course, increasingly fraying. And we had our Brexiteers dreaming of the Singapore-on-Thames. The Singapore-on-Thames basically becoming, with London becoming, or the the southeast becoming independent from the rest of the ailing and sick UK. And it would be great to become Singapore-on-Thames, but that means it's a package deal, which means you don't commodify housing.
Yeah.
And that's what they don't do in Singapore.
And it's certainly been perpetuated, the wealth inequality in the UK compared to some other countries that we would perhaps like to compare ourselves to is exacerbating. And I think from all the, the media attention around this, it's just relatively high now. But ultimately, London is essentially doing well, very well. Southeast is doing pretty well. And then the rest of the UK is basically a net, at least in terms of like tax revenues, also it's basically a drain on tax revenues. It's creating this crazy north-south divide that's kind of perpetuating.
Yeah. What we see in the data right now is actually, we see the signals of leveling up. London's economy is very vulnerable to some developments, in particular in and around AI and services. And so right now, what you actually see is that in relative terms, property prices in London are decreasing.
They are, yeah.
And outside, they are increasing. And so at some level, there is a fix, so to say, that's sort of baking into the system. But again, it sort of not speaks of a very healthy relationship between the city and what is around the city, so to say. And that's the bit that is a bit sad because, in the end of the day, if there is a national identity, so to say, there should be a mindset of trying to work on problems and resolving them together, not think of London's pain as my gain. But that's the concern. That's why we call it like leveling up by leveling down. And we see that essentially the adjustment is happening in a way that actually reduces the economic pie. But it might make some people who might have almost masochistic preferences, that derive joy from the pain of others. And that's, of course, a very sad mindset. But I can see how this is very widespread, in particular in the UK, where the political culture is one that very much invites zero-sum thinking because it's first past the post. It's winner takes all. We won it, so we got to dictate the rules. Rather than we won it, we need to learn to work with others so that they see how this is a win, a net win. It's the cooperation and the collaboration rather than sort of the contest and it's my pain, your gain.
No, yeah, that's an interesting point. I think I want to spend a little bit of time here because I think we've been in this conversation quite critical, obviously, in regards to the austerity's effects on the UK economy, and it's led to Brexit, obviously. So I think it's important to, at least where possible, play some level of devil's advocate to kind of understand sort of the reasons for implementation and what could have also been another outcome. The UK is, like a lot of other Western countries, has become pretty indebted, at least in terms of its debt to GDP ratio, particularly since 2008. Debt interest currently, I think, is predicted to be about 110 billion for the 2025-26 year. What were the alternatives to austerity? Was it a case of taking advantage of a period in which borrowing was incredibly cheap? Base rates were somewhere in the region of 0.75 to 0.1 for a very extended period of time, almost unheard of, the low interest rates. Is it because I've heard a lot of people make the argument, we should have taken advantage of that opportunity to, reinvest in the infrastructure essentially at very, very low interest rates. I guess the counter to that might be that obviously that couldn't have lasted forever. And we've certainly seen since the COVID pandemic that interest rates have had to tick up to sort of mitigate the impacts of inflation and whatnot. And is there an argument that if we had taken on increased amount of debt during that period, that we could actually be in a position now where we are even more indebted as a country than we currently are, and paying more and more in terms of our tax intake on things like debt interest?
Again, at the point in time, because the UK as a government, you find yourself in a position where you also need to finance your debt, right? So you need somebody who's willing to invest in that, right? That was taken out of the equation because we had essentially debt monetization through the central banks lapping up a lot of the debt. And in the UK, it was designed in a way that was very stupid, actually, in relationship to what, let's say, the Japanese did in terms of the, is there interest that is being paid?
They own a lot of their debt, right? That even despite Japan being incredibly indebted, it's a little bit different because they seem to own a lot of their own debt, from what I understand.
Yes. So it's not an international. So the debt is not marketed internationally, and so a lot of the vulnerabilities are not here. So I cannot comment because I've not been involved in
Sure.
In and around that time, around understanding what was the structure of the supply and demand. But in the end of the day, the central banks took out a lot of the sting, and again, my interpretation would have been, yes, now is the perfect time to double down on boosting resilience, investing in decarbonization, investing in boosting resilience, because the monetary cost of doing so, the fiscal shadow of that spending, very low. And so rather than doing that, they went through the orthodoxy of, essentially accelerating some of the structural transformation trends through the austerity cuts in a way that I think made the problem worse, as I tried to highlight, right? Because our planning systems became dysfunctional. The ability of the state to deliver, state capacity was effectively eroded in the context of an ever more and gradually worsening external security situation, because we did have the first Ukraine invasion in 2014, right? In Donbass, this was bubbling along. We had the weaponization of migration flows by geopolitical adversaries on the backs of the civil war in Syria. That was bubbling along. All of these are parts of the hybrid warfare. So if anybody, it should have been saliently clear that the world might be going into a more rough and more cold patch, not so much warm glow and fluff and fuzz. And so investing in resilience is what would have made sense, and you basically would have been paid for it to do so, because real interest rates were negative, because nominal interest rates were basically zero. It made a lot of sense. And where did that money go into? It went into frickin' real estate and actually made the problem worse and sharpened the incentives of limiting housing supply. And that's why a young generation of well-educated people, they are boogering off elsewhere to where there's a higher quality of life that awaits than just slaving away in misery in the UK. So it was definitely a missed and forgone opportunity here. But I cannot say that with any form of authority, because I've not been in that situation. Of course, we now hear a lot about, in the context of the Epstein files, about there was actually state secrets being shared, around the monetization of, essentially some of the capital flows that might have been very important to stabilize demand for debt or other forms of instruments. So we don't know. Maybe the intentions were all there, but they were undermined by a web of interests that didn't like that. So I do think an alternative would have been there. They've done the worst thing, rather than drawing in the skilled young people, that were, very familiar with frontier technology around, at the time we didn't have much about artificial intelligence, but machine learning in particular was very vogue. We could have done a lot more to digitize the state, to improve its ability to function, to make it go better, so to say. And the resources would have been there, while at the same time we could have massively invested in resilience, which could have deprived the adversaries of their ability to weaponize exposures and vulnerabilities, for example, in the energy domain. And so it was definitely a lost episode, and not just a lost episode. I would argue that it made things worse because it eroded resilience. That now puts us in this crisis situation where the state has been potentially fully, in many ways, delegitimized in its ability to cover. So tax morale might be breaking down. And that's why the tax system needs to get ever more invasive in a way that people feel like, what the fuck? Literally, it becomes like, it should be complementing the healthy development of an economy, not become part of de facto the surveillance system, which is now what it is. Now in the future, you'll be doing, if you self-assessment, you're self-employed, you need to do quarterly statements, right? So basically, you have to do what almost a listed company has to do, right? And the cost of doing so should come down. But basically, it highlights to me the government was developing ever more on the extractive side, because the pie, the perceived pie for them, was actually shrinking, because we had not expansive austerity, but actually contractive austerity. And so I would actually like to add something where, to me, this became most salient, and I was just so furious about this, was, of course, in the context of the Ukraine invasion. When the Ukraine invasion happened, what happened was energy prices spiked incredibly sharply. And that spike of energy prices meant that again, energy is it's a very vital good for households. It's just for thermal comfort and everything, right? Highlighted the lost decade of not investing in decarbonization as a resilience technology. And then we had the government under Liz Truss come about and design the energy price guarantee, which was incredibly fiscally costly. But it was an untargeted transfer. There was a lump sum payment to individual households effective. You got your £400 no matter how much you need. And everybody got a reduction in the unit price. That was across the board. Now, it is obvious to any basic economist that would say that if you think prices convey information, if you reduce the price at the margin, you're going to get people to not cut the consumption in the way that we would expect them to otherwise cut. And we saw that came a huge fiscal cost, that untargeted subsidy, and it was entirely, as I tried to argue in that paper on the informational boundaries of the state, entirely avoidable because the UK actually has really good data on energy consumption at the household level and or very granular at the local level. They could have literally posted people a check that was very much linked to their individual energy consumption, which is what the Germans did, and thereby not, thereby make the transfer more targeted, reduce the fiscal burden of it. And the cost of that high fiscal burden of the energy price guarantee was the gilt market dislocations in the fall of 2022, which now saddles the UK with a much higher debt burden. And now we have to do decarbonization in an environment where it's much, much, much more costly to do so. So we had a lost decade, and I blame that lost decade to a significant extent on the generation of economists who I would like to think, well, we know that some of these narratives originate from very dodgy empirical research. The Reinhardt and Rogoff kind of spreadsheet thing. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that. Very prominent paper that basically set up the narrative for expansive austerity, that austerity can be good for growth. And that was based on basically a very weird sample selection and an omission in an Excel spreadsheet where they excluded some data accidentally. And once you include that data, that relationship becomes far less convincing.
Oh, wow.
And that's a generation of economists who even today still have a huge amount of public sway in public debate. Because as societies, we're just really shit at telling old people to just bugger off. I mean, in a nice way, so that they don't cause harm. When in fact, that's yeah.
Yeah, I think, that's another component of this, I think, as well, is that those over 65, particularly when you consider the boomer generation spike given aging demographics, it is very politically active because I think for the most part they have a lot of time to do so compared to younger working individuals and families who are setting up careers, having families and stuff. They're just not quite as politically active. And as a result,
have to bring in the tax revenues to pay for their state pension.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we're in a very strange position where, because this boomer generation is, baby boomer generation is in that demographic, they have a very, very influential power in terms of what parties and what the policies are. And you do get things like the triple lock, which are, almost, very, very generous, to your point about it being not, being essentially above the rate of like productivity growth and inflation and stuff. In an environment where the biggest correlated factor with wealth in the UK is age. A lot of these individuals are homeowners and have seen incredible house price growth from the 90s up until the COVID pandemic. And yeah, we're in an environment where, the working population used to support, they had 16 workers to support one old age pensioner, and now we're in a situation where we have three to four workers supporting one pensioner. That isn't sustainable.
And a generation that completely disconnects because they're saying, well, this seems to be a very bad deal. So why even throw kids into that meat grinder?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting.
Why have family?
Yeah, it almost like raises the question for me in regards to pension systems, in that maybe if we'd had, like, instead of, because ultimately the pension system in the UK operates more as like a defined benefit, as in you have a defined, state pension that you're allowed, it gets mitigated, obviously. And, the current generation pays for the generation that, is currently taking that pension benefit. It's essentially a defined benefit system. The problem with that kind of system is that essentially you do have, if demographics change like we have seen, it massively throws out the balance in terms of net contributions versus other. If we'd had maybe a system maybe more akin to a defined contribution system, in which, the government maybe topped up an amount based on contributions into it, it's maybe not as susceptible to these wildly changing aging demographics, because ultimately the pot is there for you to take out to some degree when you retire, and it doesn't really matter how many people are paying into the pot when you're younger. I think about this when we're, maybe there's some elements of reform, but I mean, ultimately, the problems obviously are, that's a long-term solution to something that you're not going to see for a long time. And you can't just cut off state benefit for people that have essentially been planning to have that for, 30 plus years or so, right? And so it's just a very, very difficult situation.
Let me mindfuck you. Let me mindfuck you right here.
Okay.
Because I think that's actually really important, because most British people don't know this. Actually, even at some point I spoke with a former minister in a domain where I would have expected her to know that. Do you know when you become a beneficiary or a liability on the British state pension? Like, what's the minimum threshold for you to become a liability?
No, I'm not sure.
A liability means you need to be part of the system for this and this many time, or you would have contributed.
Yeah, right.
So the British system of state pension, other countries have very similar things. So I'm not just pointing out the UK here as something in some form, but it's very sinister insofar that you can be a young person coming to the UK studying and then working here for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. And then you return to your own country. You would have contributed to the state pension. You would have contributed typically through tax, income tax. You would have contributed through your VAT, to your consumption taxes. In many ways, you would have given your youth to this country. And then you bugger off within 9 years. If you don't complete your 10 years, there's nothing.
Yeah,
you get nada, nothing. Which, again, if you think about societies who have such systems, and these systems create such incentives, it creates a demand for demographic churn that is very sinister, because typically it would be people who are not well informed that would see, by the time when they're then 65 and they're like, oh, now it's time to retire, they see, oh shit, I got screwed by the UK for 10 years.
Yeah, because it's obviously very complicated. And this also brings another element into this, is that if you are going to have this kind of...
It's a part of the financing, right? And so creates one way of thinking about what the implication of this is, that it is creating a politics of the like that Brexit gave us. Because Brexit was very much among, what the UKIPers did, or the Leave campaign did, very much pit one immigrant group against the other. The narrative and the messaging for Southeast Asians was very much, you have less rights than the bloody Pole. That was very much the messaging that was conveyed. It was pitting up one immigration group against the other. For the Indian community, there was this, oh, you're going to get your visas for your curry chefs, for the restaurants, like there was a very much pitting one group against the other. It was seeding conflict between two groups, where one group had zero political representation, which is the EU citizens in the UK who have no right to vote, whereas another group had rights to vote, through virtue of affiliation with the British Empire, right? Whereby British overseas residents, nationals, you can vote, right? If you're, if you're, a BNI, I think, which means you had some immigrants who were pitted up against other immigrant groups, and so that creates that system incentive to create churn every 10 years. You want people to come and go, because you contribute for 10 years, but you never become a liability. That's a net win. And that's like, it's a very similar to how we think about trade and, countries having trade imbalances, right? It's a beggar thy neighbor policy that creates a demand for population swaps. I'm not suggesting that Keir Starmer is sitting there and saying, well, I'm gonna fuck around some people, in India because I want to move them here and like exploit them for 10 years. But of course, bilateral trade agreements, investment treaties, and all of these things, or trade agreements, often have a social chapter, and that involves essentially some form of debate that might induce societies or systems to think of people, individuals, as essentially just masses of potential contributors, but not potential liabilities. And so that's something that very few people are actually aware of.
No, and it ironically, this brings us right back to Brexit and other areas of demographics, because if you are going to have this kind of defined benefit type pension structure, you need to actively control the demographics. Otherwise, to your point, and our points we've been making, you just cannot afford to maintain the pension system. And that means you need to have an influx of young people. And as we very know, fertility rates have crashed actually across the globe, actually. It's not just in the UK or even developed countries. A lot of developing countries are actually seeing a lot of this as well, ironically. But even if you were to set up a system where you're encouraging, you're funneling benefits to, to people to start families stuff, and you could get the fertility rate up. That's not a benefit. It's not going to be seen for 30 years until those kids essentially become value-adding contributors into the pension system. And so the irony is, if you want to support these sort of decisions and these policies for pensioners of that age demographic, you need migrants, because you need young working people to come in, pay taxes, and contribute into that system. And to your point, you could even make the argument with with being a part of the EU, is that so many young people used to come to the UK just to spend some time here, do seasonal work, and pay taxes, and then would actually then go back to their European countries of origin. And so the irony is that the portion of the population that wants to continue and maintain the social state, social security, and benefits for people in that elderly age range are actively voting against policies that would allow that to be a sustainable model. Now, and by the way, that doesn't mean that there's Thomas Howell has the quote, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, right? There are ramifications to importing a load of labor into the labor market, particularly from cheaper demographics, so suppressing wage growth and all these kind of stuff, and not to mention sort of the cultural integration aspects. But it is interesting that, so much of this actually does come back to aging demographics in many ways, and how we as a country manage that from an economic standpoint.
Exactly. No, again, it's very important. Of course, the pillars are there to make the UK, in terms of the pension system, more defined contribution, so that transition is underway. But the UK also has a legacy of a generation that did not save enough. And for that generation, old age poverty in the UK is much higher. It's also in Germany, it's a big problem. So we have this generation of people who just, were not educated that this is a very important part. And actually, right now, if anything, we're moving in the opposite direction, where people they're not invited to think medium or long term. You're the perfect consumer if you're an impulse buyer, because that's when the ability of the system, so to say, to extract a premium price is the highest, right? It's all geared towards that. So we're actually creating, in some, when I say this very provocatively, through the dumbing down of generations, through the, attention economies, you are effectively creating a flock of sheep that is very easy to direct. Because they don't think long term or medium term. You remove their context windows, and then you become a predictable consumer, and that you can monetize. You can monetize the right of selling your product in 3 days' time. That becomes, in the hyper financialized economy, that becomes something that's tradable, and so the system basically creates dumb people. Again, I'm using very blunt language here to illustrate this, but that's one way of how you can think about it. And of course, AI is now raising the awareness of that, and I would like to think and hope will change that, because people get more educated about how algorithms and the gray matter or the dark matter is actually already governing, and affecting people's lives deeply. But on the point of demography, that is exactly the curse. And actually, it's even worse if you are in a society like China or in other parts of emerging market economies, because there the rate of aging is much, 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 much faster than anything that we've seen in Europe. In Europe, we've been doing this like for about a couple hundred years now, right? And whereas what happens in China is, policy aggravated, but the rate at demographic change is incredibly fast. And so that might need to imply that there's a much faster rate of innovation to deal with that. But many of these innovations can have dual use. And then a nation that doesn't have this problem, let's call it the United States, just cannot relate with that because the United States does not have that demographic issue in the same way that Europe and China has it. And that's why in anything that goes on in geopolitics, Europe and China work much better together, actually, in some ways, than with the Americans, because we face similar problems. And so, again, that's part of sort of the bigger picture of how this sort of matters when it comes to geopolitics, because a lot of geopolitics is just about engineering the very like population movements that could help countries in relative terms ease the various pressures. But not all countries share the understanding or have a consensus over that population movements should be the product of people making positive choices to move somewhere, as is articulated through the idea of freedom of movement. You want to be free to move. The same way, in other societies, there's a much more coercive approach, right? And of course, the most violent way of engineering and creating such population movements that could affect the demography is through conflict. And if you look at the data, I mean, that's the perverse thing. For Ukraine faces a demographic disaster. It's the men who stay behind fight. They get sort of eroded on the front. It's a lot of young women who've left. And of course, that will create relationships and connections between Ukraine and Europe in embodied form, because there will be offspring. I think the rate of Ukrainian and British marriages has gone up the same way, I think, in Germany. If you look at the data. So it's in a very perverse way, that's how you build long-term links and relationships. But it's the product in this case, not of most of these Ukrainian women, they probably would have stayed. And it was the violent act of that war that sort of induced that population movement that now might here help us taper over our demographic issues that are mostly a product of our own fuck-ups.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting problem, and it's going to be interesting to see how it gets remediated, at least in the future. Thiemo, this has been like a really, really great conversation. We've delved into a lot of different areas there in regards to these things. It's been really great. I think just to leave off on, is there something in regards to austerity or Brexit, some kind of policy thing, or maybe perhaps an economic reality that perhaps isn't generally aware or known about in the general populace that you think would be really useful for people to understand? Or is there potentially like a piece of research or a book or a piece of knowledge base that you think people could look up on it would really be beneficial?
So it's like spill some beans, so to say, of
Kind of, yeah.
a sort of a nugget. So one thing that I mean, I'm looking at this now in this work on leveling up by leveling down, which looks at sort of the economic consequences of Brexit. And, that sort of almost, it's to me like the consequence of zero sum thinking, so to say, in lived reality by London losing out, the rest of the countryside in relative terms evening up. So that's, a very important observation. During the work on that paper, there was one puzzling relationship. Not a puzzling one, but I mean, I had a mental model of what's going on, and that mental model is now being put into work in that new project. Is that some people, it's almost like politics as a luxury good. When you're well off, if you've nothing to worry about, or if you're relatively comfortable, then you can afford to engage in policy making that might be harmful to you, but you derive joy from the fact that it's more harmful for others. And so what we see on around the austerity is that a lot of the people who are comfortable, who would have had an indirect exposure to austerity, which they misattributed to immigration or whatnot, they are the ones who seem most susceptible to advocating for policy changes in and around communities that they know of but have no connection to. And so, it's basically the consequence of spatial and segregation that is a lived reality that can create a politics of division whereby if you're personally ring-fenced from something, or you feel like, I can afford to lose 50K or 100K or whatnot, if you have that type of mindset, you can engage in policy making that might be harmful to some people and you derive joy from that. You see, this is like, what's the psychological foundation of a policy mindset, or a mindset that gives you something that actively takes pleasure in reducing the pie for everybody, but in relative terms, increasing the slice for some that you might perceive to be more deserving. That type of mindset and thinking, to me, is at the heart of what can explain policy things, policy articulations like austerity. The other part is now the world that we are entering in. The world that we're entering in now is that technology actually can really revolutionize the state. And we should not, in this case, be blind to its possibilities, because there is a lot of debt, so to say, that the state has in being seen as being much more functional, especially because of what's going on around the world with the conflict and the war. And so here, I do think that, enabling the state to deliver better, to lean on technology, I think is exactly the right call. And the UK and in Germany, we see this push around, GovTech. They call it GovTech. Because in the many instances, it literally is about filling out forms, showing up to appointments. It's a lot of intermediation. It's a lot of things that is precisely what AI can do a lot better. And this is now where actually it's very dangerous to say, oh, we can't pay, decent salaries in the public sector to compete for the human capital and the resources that might be delivering exactly these systems or these solutions for the public sector to work better. And in this case, I'm actually a proponent for a bit of pressure on the public sector. Again, my mental model is that there has been this sort of, upgrading or promotion in the public sector as a way of maintaining pay progression, potentially beyond, let's say, skills and competencies or capabilities. we need to make the public sector in that sense a bit more uncomfortable in a way that actually creates concrete, perceived improvements in the quality of service delivery, which means we need to bring a lot of the people that with AI will be removed from the back office to the frontline service delivery, so that the visibility of the state is increased, because we're in a very, very risky, almost tipping point scenario where we need ever more coercive, extractive instruments around taxation that basically undermine any idea of why we should even have a separation between the government and the private sector. Like that becomes ever more tangible, saying, well, seriously, I can get AI to fill out my taxes. Why do I need to pay for an accountant to do that for me? If you're in that state of mind, you really need to make sure that, the legitimacy of the system, so to say, gets improved. And that one way of doing that is just by making it much more accessible. And we have a lot of people who struggle with access to, for example, the state through digital tools, services, and so on, aging communities, and so on. And that's exactly where a lot of the middle management that will be gutted out by AI, because a lot of the information flows can be intermediated and automated. These people will now either be asked to exit or to get into much more frontline services, and then create human layers and interactions between the state and citizens, and thereby re-legitimize the state, because it's lost its legitimacy. And the legitimacy, in many instances, is very dangerous. Right now, some narratives of legitimacy boil down to, well, we need the state to defend us from the adversaries, from ending up in a scenario like in Ukraine. Many people say, like, fuck, just give it to Putin. And that's very dangerous. It's a very slippery slope, because violence, war, can never be condoned as a technology of trying to convince people. Coercion and violence, we cannot give in domestically in our societies. We cannot, these narratives, we cannot let win. And so that's why I said the state needs to legitimize itself, not by saying, well, you need us because we protect you from bombs falling on top of you, and that's why you pay your taxes. No, we need you, and we are working on improving the delivery by improving the physical and the visual and the experiential interfaces with the state. That means more police on the street, just make it more visible. It means getting civil servants or public sector workers who right now might be in a position like, oh shit, I don't want AI to replace my job, so I'm going to try to make it really difficult to adopt that technology. We need to get these people out into the real world, into connections, to figure out how to solve problems rather than just managing processes, because that's what they've been relegated to.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that's going to be a very important part, particularly as we move into an age where we're constricting financial resources. The tax rates are already, the tax burden is already very high. It's going to be efficiency in these regards is going to become more and more upon. I think, it's going to be a very interesting area too. Thiemo, thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate you doing it.
Okay.